Hi, my name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this series of lectures I want to talk to you about a book written by the American philosopher Richard Rorty. The book is called Contingency, Irony and Solidarity and it was published in 1989. The way that I am envisaging these lectures is like this. You have the book and you are reading the book. Maybe you've already read it, or maybe you are reading it as you move through these videos. And after reading a chapter, or maybe before reading a chapter, you watch the corresponding video. And what I'm going to be trying to do is I'm going to try to explain maybe some of the main points that Rorty is making, maybe tell you something about some of the difficult parts or more unfamiliar authors that Rorty is talking about. And of course also give you my own thoughts on what is happening in these chapters. Basically what I want to do here is the same kind of thing that I would be doing if I were teaching a seminar about contingency, irony and solidarity at the university. With one major difference, which is that if I'm teaching to a group of students in real life, they can actually ask me questions and we will have discussions and so on and so forth. This will be unfortunately a little bit more one-sided. Nevertheless, I hope that these lectures will help you understand the book and get as much out of it as possible. So in this first introductory lecture, I want to tell you a little bit about Richard Rorty, and I want to look at the introduction of the book itself, which sort of prefigures some of the main themes that we will encounter as we move through the main part of the book. So Richard Rorty, as I said, is an American philosopher, and he started his career by publishing, technical philosophical articles within the tradition that we tend to call analytic philosophy. At a certain point, Rorty becomes disenchanted with this tradition of analytic philosophy, and he writes a book about that disenchantment. That book is called Philosophy and a Mirror of Nature. Philosophy and a Mirror of Nature is an incredibly interesting book, but in order to really understand it and in order to sort of get a lot out of it, you need to know quite a bit about the analytic philosophy that Rorty is arguing against or is reacting to. So you would have to have some knowledge of people like Quine and Sellers and Putnam and Davidson and all those guys and all those debates that those people were parts of. Contingency, Irony and Solidarity was written a little bit later, and its intended audience is more general. You will find that Rorty mentions lots and lots of thinkers from, mainly the Western European traditions, both in philosophy, but also in literature, in literary studies, in psychology, really all across the board. I mean, this is not, in that sense, an easy book or a book that doesn't require any preparation. But the preparation that it requires is far less specific, far less specialist, is maybe the right word to use. Sometimes I'm going to explain some of the ideas, some of the authors that Rorty is referring to. At other times, there's a lot of them, and some of them, if I have to explain Nietzsche to you, we could use a couple of lectures to do that, and maybe more than a couple of lectures too. So sometimes either you will already know something about an author, or you will learn something about the author by reading what Rorty has to say about that. Okay. Now, what is contingency, irony, and solidarity about? Well, it's about contingency, irony, and solidarity. The most unfamiliar of these three words is no doubt contingency, which basically means something like possible but not necessary. In general, we would call something contingent if it's the case, but it didn't have to be the case. So if, for instance, I say that the moral system that we have, right, the kind of moral convictions that we have, if I say that they are contingent, then what I'm saying is that they could have been different, right? It would have been possible for us to have different moral convictions, and so for many other things as well. Rorty is going to argue that lots of things that philosophers of the past and even philosophers of the present have thought were necessary are in fact contingent, and morality is definitely one of those things, which according to Rorty is contingent. Solidarity and irony are things that we will meet here in the introduction in a little while, so I'll define them when we come to that. Let's read a little bit from the beginning of the introduction. So here I am at Roman page 13, XIII. Here are the first lines of the introduction. The attempt to fuse the public and the private lies behind both Plato's attempt to answer the question, why is it in one's interest to be just, and Christianity's claim that perfect self-realization can be attained through service to others. So the public and the private, what does that mean? Well, the private has to do with me. It has to do with how I think of myself. It has to do with how I, try to come to self-realization, how I try to make myself into the person that I want to be. It's about my own vision for myself, my own interpretation of myself. That is what Rorty is going to call the private. The public is about how I relate to other people, and especially it is going to involve things like morality, like how I treat other people, what I do for other people, my duties maybe to other people, all that kind of stuff. So in a question like, why is it in one's interest to be just? Well, what's in my interest? That's the private. Being just, that is the public. So here we see an attempt to bring the public and the private together. And Rorty is going to suggest, well, he is suggesting here, that a lot of thinkers from the Western tradition have tried to marry the private and the public. They've tried to show that, like maybe coming to a state of perfect morality or treating other people in the way that I ought to treat them, and coming to a state of perfect self-realization are the same thing, right? And so maybe somebody like Plato would say that if I, manage to get to that, peak of philosophical insight where I see the idea of the good, that's what's going to, well, first of all, that's sort of the aim of my private life, right? That is what I as an individual want to be striving for, this vision of the good. And at the same time, it's going to give me the knowledge that I need in order to be a morally perfect human being. So the public and the private sort of come together. They are basically, they end up being the same thing. Rorty's project in contingency, irony and solidarity is going to be to convince us that we shouldn't try to do this. He's going to try to convince us that the public and the private cannot be married in such a way. That our public attempts to live together and our wishes and hopes for how we should arrange like society and how we should treat each other are something very, very different from our private hopes about the kind of person that we want to be, about our creative projects and things like that. And for Rorty, this history in European thought of trying to bring the public and the private together is a history of disappointment, of failure, which in fact has had many negative consequences. So here on this first page, Rorty puts forward Hegel as a thinker who, through a historical way of approaching things, has tried to get beyond the familiar standoff. So that's the standoff between people on the one hand who ask us to believe that what is most important to each of us is what we have in common with others, that the springs of private fulfillment and of human solidarity are the same on the one hand, so those who want to marry the public and the private, and on the other hand, people like Nietzsche who claim that at the deepest level of the self there is no sense of human solidarity, that this sense is a mere artifact of human socialization, and these skeptics would be anti-social, according to Rorty. So here we have sort of two positions, right? The public and the private come together, or a true insight into the private shows that we have no public obligations, that there's just the private and nothing else. Okay, so what is a thinker like Hegel, somebody who has an historical approach to things, how is he supposed to change this situation of Plato versus Nietzsche, if that's how we want to think of it? Well, what they have done is they have denied that there is such a thing as human nature, that there is such a thing as the deepest level of the self. This is where Rorty's idea of contingency comes in, right? Contingency, the idea that, for instance, who I am, even at the deepest level, is just something that happens to be that way, just something that depends on my idiosyncratic individual history, and is not some deep necessity of human nature. That is what an insight into the contingency of human existence gives us, and that is, at the same time, what makes it possible for us to move beyond the traditional standoff. Because both Plato and Nietzsche, on the reading that Rorty has been giving here, both Plato and Nietzsche believe that there is such a thing as, the core of human nature. And either it turns out to be, fundamentally moral, or it turns out to be fundamentally amoral, but there is a core of human nature. Okay, so what Rorty is claiming is that once we embrace contingency, right, once we come to the insight that no, there is no such necessary core of human nature, then we can move beyond the question of whether the public has any right of existence, and whether the private and the public can be married, and so on and so forth. And the way that Rorty phrases this here is he says, this historicist turn has helped free us gradually but steadily from theology and metaphysics, from the temptation to look for an escape from time and chance. Right? So what Rorty is going to try to convince us of is that we shouldn't try to escape from time and chance. We should embrace the fact that we are the product of a history full of accidents, full of chance, full of things that could just as well have happened otherwise. Well, says Rorty, there are still, even if you accept this sort of historical reading of things, there are still at least two types of historicists. There are people like Heidegger and Foucault who desire especially self-creation, autonomy. And there are historicists who, especially desire a free human community. What is it that we should be sort of striving for? Well, Rorty says, what I'm going to try to do in this book is I'm going to try to suggest that these two types of thinkers are not really opposed. What I'm going to try to suggest is that the kind of life that we could be living, and the kind of life that I want to convince you ought to be living, well, ought in a very local sense, right? Not ought as some fundamental moral law, but, ought in the sense of here, don't you see that this is the best thing for you? The kind of life that you ought to be living is a kind of life where we have a private and a public set of wishes and desires, and we don't try to bring them together. We see them as two things that are sort of there, sort of separate, but that can coexist more or less peacefully. The two words from the title, irony and solidarity, are going to be the central terms for understanding our private and our public concerns. Irony belonging to the private, and solidarity clearly belonging to the public. So on page Roman 15, XV, here is what Rorty says. So I'm starting more or less at the top of the page. This book tries to show how things look if we drop the demand for a theory which unifies the public and the private, and are content to treat the demands of self-creation and of human solidarity as equally valid, yet forever incommensurable. And incommensurable is this term that Rorty takes from Thomas Kuhn and Paul Feyerabend, and maybe also from Hansson. What it means is that, you can't, well, literally it means that you can't measure them together, that you can't measure them with the same measure. It means that you can't really compare them, right? They're just in different realms. You can't bring them together because they are, of totally different kinds. So they're incommensurable. It sketches a figure whom I call the liberal ironist. And so what Rorty is going to do, he's not so much going to claim that we ought to be liberal ironists in the sense that, that is the core of human nature. because he doesn't believe that there's a core of human nature, or that it's sort of the moral law, because he doesn't believe that there's that kind of moral law. What he is going to do is he is going to paint this picture of the liberal ironist in the hope that we, seeing that, think, oh yes, that is who I want to be. Right? So this, at a very basic level, is what Rorty's book is going to try to do. He's going to try to paint a picture of the liberal ironist, hoping that we, you and I, look at that picture and think, yeah, that's who I want to be. I want to be a liberal ironist. And so the overall structure of the book is not so much an argument for a particular conclusion, although there's lots of argumentation in it, but there's also lots of historical storytelling, there is analysis of poetry, there is sort of, cultural criticism, there's all kinds of things going on. The overall aim of it being that we look at the picture that emerges of this liberal ironist and we end up saying, that is a pretty good self-description. I want to apply that self-description to myself. So this is not a philosophy book in some traditional sense where there's a clear thesis and Rorty argues for it. Of course he's going to have theses along the way, but the main point is to convince us to take up a certain kind of stance, to take up or apply to ourselves a certain kind of self-description. Okay, so what's the liberal ironist? A liberal is someone who thinks that cruelty is the worst thing we do, Rorty tells us, and an ironist is a person who faces up to the contingency of his or her own most central beliefs and desires. Someone sufficiently historicist and nominalist to have abandoned the idea that those central beliefs and desires refer back to something beyond the reach of time and chance. So somebody who even my most cherished beliefs and ideals don't come from eternity, they don't come from some eternal God, they don't come from some eternal necessary way that human beings are. No, they're just the end product of some kind of historical sequence that leads to me. That's the way that the ironist thinks about their own inmost, most important convictions. And the ironist becomes a liberal ironist when they include among these ungroundable desires their own hope that suffering will be diminished, that the humiliation of human beings by other human beings may cease. So, that is the aim of the book, and basically the rest of the introduction reiterates these ideas. That's the aim of the book. Contingency is sort of the starting point, right? There is no fundamental way that human beings are. There is no fundamental way that human society is, or anything like that. And this allows us to tell a particular story about the public and the private, which is the story of the liberal ironist, of somebody who, has certain social hopes. They want to get rid of cruelty. They want to, in a sense, they want people to be nice to each other. They want people to help each other out. They want there to be a community, not war and humiliation and oppression and stuff like that. So that's the liberal part. And they can do this while, not thinking of their own ways of thinking as being somehow given by some deep and grounded necessity of the world or human nature. The book is shaped also in terms of contingency, irony, and solidarity, in the sense that the first part of the book is about contingency, and then we go to irony, and then we go to solidarity. And so what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to delve into chapter 1 and talk about the contingency of language.